Most people who look out at the landscape of the current year acknowledge that there is what has been termed a crisis of meaning. Beyond all the distractions, the consumerism, the myriad things that serve only to grab and squander one's attention, there appears to be little of substance beneath it all, whence it is claimed we find ourselves in this so-called crisis of meaning. I don't fundamentally disagree, though I do think this is not the first time, albeit in the past, crises of meaning arose in response to circumstances different from our own. Europe experienced its own crisis of meaning during and in the wake of the Reformation, Japan when forced to industrialize in the 19th century, and likely more than any other point in time in the West in the wake of World War II. And it is at this temporal point that I wish to depart from. The end of World War II represented in many ways the absolute exhaustion point for the collective minds of the West. Certainly communism persisted and remained a serious matter and threat, but the sheer destruction and desolation that was wrought, coupled by the ideological fervor behind the conflict, was and has been unparalleled in history. The rapid diminution of the role of religion and humanity's continuous loss of faith in the God construct accelerated this and further contributed to the post-World War II crisis of meaning. Into this void entered a new type of philosophy and train of thought that some people term existentialism. Broadly speaking, existentialism is an umbrella term encompassing philosophical strains of thought that stress the existence of the individual, that existence is particular to the individual, and that the greatest problem of existence is existence itself. Many of you might be at least familiar with the French philosopher Albert Camus, who rightly or wrongly is often put into the category of existentialist philosopher, a category that he himself during his lifetime rejected as an attribution to his own philosophy and thought, but nonetheless seems to have had so much overlap with existentialism that he's regardless shoehorned into the category. But his primary philosophical preoccupation was with the absurdist school of philosophical thought. Despite much overlap, absurdism and existentialism as loosely coherent schools of thought are in fact distinct, though people disagree about the nature of that distinction. My own take on the distinction would be as follows. Whereas both absurdism and existentialism have nihilistic underpinnings, i.e. that intrinsic meaning is unextractable from the universe and reality, and therefore from human affairs, the distinction between the two lies in the reaction to that state. The existentialist resolves to construct meaning for himself in a universe void of such meaning, through a combination of self-awareness, self-imposed responsibility, and the proactive search for things that give him personal meaning and significance, whereas the absurdist believes that any search for meaning contradicts the underlying premise of nihilism, namely that there is no intrinsic meaning, and that to search for any sort of thing one might call meaning creates an inherent incompatibility, and therefore is inherently incoherent. I don't particularly wish to nitpick the differences here, because there's substantially more overlap than difference, so we shall move on. For now, let us return to the baseline view of lack of meaning and what one can do given such a worldview. Give or take, there are three options. The first option is the creation of a framework of meaning or the embracing of an already established framework of meaning. Any well-established religion would come to mind for the latter, but for the former, it becomes trickier, though I will argue now and later on that the former occurs rather automatically in most cases for most human beings, and that this automaticity does not even occur on the conscious level, that meaning creation is more or less an automatic reflex in humans, at least to some degree. The second option is the acceptance of lack of meaning and consequently living with it, or in spite of it, or even against it. And the third option, or the final option, no pun intended, is the premature commission of oneself to oblivion, which typically results from a combination of boredom, pain, and a state of being overwhelmed. This video in particular is meant to address some aspects of the current crisis of meaning, and more specifically those who, for whatever reason, have lost the automatic reflex of meaning creation, as it were, something that is becoming more and more common as time progresses, above all in so-called online communities. But before we go there, let us first dispense with a recurrent theme in recent years, and that is the theme and meme of cope. In the last few years, the meme/accusation of cope has emerged, used universally as an insult to describe one's lack of X. And take your pick here and fill in the blanks as to what X might be and the subsequent course of action taken in order to compensate for said lack of X. implying that if one had X, one would not be engaging in the alleged cope to deal with the purported lack of X. Now, to the best of my knowledge, the use of the term cope in contemporary understanding emerged fairly recently to describe life directions and opinions that detractors simply didn't agree with. So far, so good. Of course, traditionally, the idea of coping implied doing your best under difficult circumstances, and its connotation was far less pejorative than is currently implied in the contemporary use of the term. With all that said, it is important to explore the actual meaning behind cope, for if we were to do so, we would soon discover that human existence is defined by quote-unquote cope. Human existence, from the moment the light of cognition illuminates the world, must necessarily grapple with several absolutes of human life, one of which has already been touched upon in the opening of this video, i.e. the creation of meaning. Finitude nicely sums up the other absolute of human existence. It's imperfection, the long stretches of discontentment it instills in us as we hop on one hedonic treadmill after the other in the search for the phantasm called happiness in common parlance, illness, which can strike at any time, and finally, the absolute assurance of death and the likely annihilation of all that you were that follows. In a nutshell, human existence is terrifying, at least on some fundamental level, and humans can and do come up with every means, device, and manner to divert that terror away from themselves. In the best case scenario, to drive it away completely, something that usually fails, and in the less successful attempts to merely push it some distance away, kicking the can down the road, as it were, full well knowing it will return sooner rather than later. Given this, virtually every action taken by man is an effort to, using the current year's terminology, cope, and it always has been. Sincere religious belief, community, love, friendship, preoccupation, and the state of being busy and engrossed in any given thing, fun, hope itself, all these serve, whether consciously or not, to ward off the specter of looming terror that is always present. In short, life is a series of exercises in cope, and each and every human being is doing it in one shape, form, or another. No exception. All of these encompass strategies that are part and parcel of terror management theory, or in a nutshell, the conflict of interest that exists between the inevitability of death and the desire for self-preservation. Seemingly alone amongst the animals, man finds himself in the unique and somewhat tragic position of possessing mortality salience, a byproduct and consequence of heightened self-awareness, which, as with virtually all things, acts as a double-edged sword. Shakespeare's play Macbeth rather handily illustrates this. Hearing the prophecy of the weird sisters that he, Macbeth, shall be king of Scotland, and spurred on by his own ego, and frankly his wife's ambition, Macbeth murders King Duncan to force about the prophecy he had heard. The deed committed, Macbeth must plunge himself into further murder, deceit, and tyranny, all the while racked by internal guilt and paranoia, all of which collapses in on itself as his wife takes her own life, and he is forced to confront all the noise and senselessness that brought him to this point. She should have died hereafter. There would have been a time for such a word. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day, to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Act 5, Scene 5, nicely illustrates the reality of universal cope. It is encapsulated in the phrase the sound and fury. The sound and fury is whatever we humans do to cope with the futility of our actions, ambitions, dreams, and desires. The player, strutting and fretting his hour upon the stage, is me, you, and every other human being you have met or will ever meet. Lost in the illusion of whatever momentary conceit drove you to your ephemeral purpose as it sustains you for yet another minute, until the minute spills into the hour and death's knell calls you to quietude. With this, let us put the cope mean to rest as surely as Macbeth's hollow ambitions. Cope is a necessity as the human animal, and it should be accepted for what it is, whatever the situation might be, whatever cope might be involved. No, there are more important questions to be answered. And we will now return to Camus, and specifically one of his chief works, The Myth of Sisyphus. But before we do this, let us first speak of the figure of Sisyphus. Sisyphus was a prominent figure in Greek mythology, who reigned as a king, an incredibly deceitful and arrogant tyrant that angered the gods enormously. Sisyphus fancied himself the most clever of all, and still more clever than even Zeus himself. Even in the underworld, he sought to trick and cajole his way out of punishment, as he managed to trick death itself into the very chains that were meant to shackle him and intended for him, thus for a time abrogating death for all mortals. And even after death is freed, Sisyphus manages to flee the underworld, once again eluding the justice the gods sought to visit upon him. Incensed and annoyed by Sisyphus' hubris, perpetual defiance, and perhaps more pointedly than anything else, his success, Zeus conceives a fitting task for him. He is to forever push a heavy boulder up a steep hill, whereupon the boulder would without fail roll back down to the bottom, forcing Sisyphus to repeat the task for all eternity. In this way, no amount of deception, trickery, or cleverness could save him from his punishment. And there are several literary interpretations of the Sisyphus figure, and they vary throughout the ages, but one of the most modern interpretations is offered to us by none other than Albert Camus. In his essay, Camus presents us with the absurd situation of man, the creature who labors and builds for the tomorrow that will never come, as each day diminishes the fire of hope by drawing us closer to death. And in essence, this is the predicament of the absurd. And to quote Camus himself, "My appetite for the absolute and for unity meets the impossibility of reducing this world to a rational and reasonable principle." Although reason and understanding can explain phenomena as they exist in the world, they ultimately fail in providing the psychological insulation that humans require to persist in the face of the absurd. Consequently, the only relevant question to Camus, and it can be argued to the human ape, is whether or not one ought to continue until one is claimed by death, or end it prematurely, by terminating oneself prior to one's allotted time. Camus' unorthodox interpretation of Sisyphus is therefore an interpretation of the heroic. In defying the gods, in outsmarting death itself, Sisyphus is the ultimate hero. But what does he do when he's eternally enslaved to Zeus's will in the form of his punishment? A thankless and pointless task with no definition of success. No amount of cleverness can make him escape it. Camus is most interested in interpreting what Sisyphus must think as he endlessly repeats the task. He's without hope, but Camus imagines that Sisyphus would find himself content in his defiance of an irreversible fate. It is in the acknowledgement of the futility of his task that Sisyphus ceases to be bothered and held back by it. This was the lesson that Macbeth failed to learn. Let us now look at a comic scenario drawn from the DC animated universe, and I do apologize for necessary spoilers. I still urge you to check the film out if you're so inclined. Now, whether you're a comic fan or not, the DC animated universe's presentation of the character and villain of Owlman is something one ought not to simply overlook, because the figure presented to us in the 2010 film Justice League: Crisis on Two Earths gives us much food for thought. The discovery of parallel Earths or dimensions renders Owlman starkly aware of his predicament. Despite being a powerful crime boss in the villainous organization, the Crime Syndicate, the multiplicity of different Earths and dimensions renders in his mind null and void his influence and power, and this, coupled with an already inherent pessimism and humanity, drives Owlman to seek out something called Earth Prime, after having discovered and developed something called the QED, or Quantum Eigenstate Device, allowing him to search and navigate alternative Earths with the end goal of finding the original Earth, or Earth Prime as he terms it, the existence of which is crucial for all other derivative Earths, he deduces. Owlman, through a combination of his personality and his discovery, is led to believe that choices do not matter, because each choice branches off into an alternate reality of Earth, potentially begetting infinite Earths. The solution to the problem of choice, as he puts it, is the destruction of Earth Prime, upon which all other Earths are contingent. Having determined the position of Earth Prime, he transports himself there with the intention of destroying it, and thereby destroying all Earth realities. For he sees this as the only action of consequence, the only choice that can be made that can matter. But Batman gives chase and confronts him, whereupon they have an exchange of words. Some of the dialogue is relevant because both Batman and Owlman are making very salient points. Welcome to Earth Prime. Before there was thought, there was this place, one Earth with a single history. But with the coming of man came the illusion of free will, and with that illusion came chaos. With every choice we make, We literally create a world. History branches in two, creating one Earth, where we made the choice, and a second, where we didn't. That's the secret of the universe, you know. Billions of people making billions of choices, creating infinite Earths. Some so similar to each other that you could spend a lifetime searching for any distinction. Others so radically different they defy comprehension. And all the branches originate here. Every version of reality balances precariously on this singular Earth. It seems so different from the Earth we know. I can't imagine what series of decisions led to this world hurtling out of its orbit. But I know this. The source of the cataclysm was the same as it always is. Man. You can't be sure of that. You know better. Man is a cancer, and I've chosen to cut out the disease. You're talking about killing everyone who has ever lived, who ever will live. I choose to make the only possible real choice. You're insane. Does it really matter? There are alternative versions of me that you would find quite charming. And then they square off. Batman gains the upper hand, and finally, as Batman is about to send Owlman off to an alternative Earth with a massive bomb in tow, he says, "There is a difference between you and me. We both looked into the abyss, but when it looked back at us, you blinked." The sequence of dialogue can obviously be interpreted in multiple ways, but in the context of the topic thus far addressed, there is one interpretation that is more likely than others. Owlman correctly assesses that choices in this multiverse merely branch off in their consequences into other realities, and that their consequences are not singular or confined, and ripple outwards ad infinitum, but also commits the error of becoming too wrapped up in the grand scale, something many of us can sympathize with, and he has become obsessed with this vision, believing that the annihilation of everything is the only meaningful choice to be made, and the only truly consequential one. Now, on the face of it, in a very technical sense, Owlman is correct, but he is only correct on the macro scale, and human beings operate, broadly speaking, on two levels. The macro scale, which is a consequence of being far more sapient and sentient than other animals, and something that frequently draws us into these states of pensiveness, and the micro scale, which is something that we share with less sapient and less sentient animals. Humans seem to require some sort of balance between the two in order to function and operate successfully during our brief tenure on Earth. Too much focus on either the macro or the micro throws a necessary equilibrium out of balance, with detrimental, albeit different side effects. Owlman has lost his sense of balance, which has driven him to the extreme action he's taken, as he sees no plausible counterpoint to his view. But Batman in this scene offers an interesting and compelling interpretation. His final line and his farewell address to Owlman is very telling, after Owlman has pointed out the myriad similarities between the two. There is a difference between you and me. We both looked into the abyss, but when it looked back at us, you blinked. Of course, this is a reference to the famous quote of Nietzsche: "He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster, and when you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you." But more to the point, the abyss in this interpretation is the absurd, the meaningless, the leviathan that threatens to swallow man whole and does so regularly. Even more to the point, Owlman, in losing sight of what was in front of his nose and only looking at the bigger picture, blinked and lost his path. It's not that Batman is unaware of the abyss or the ultimate futility of human action. He is. But he, in a manner not too dissimilar to Sisyphus, can see past it to focus on the immediate task before him, embracing the absurdity of it all and continuing nonetheless. Gotham, for example, will never cease being what it is, a crime-ridden cesspit, regardless of what Batman does or undertakes. But that's not the point, as Batman sees the abyss more clearly than most, but manages to accept it and continue in a way that Owlman could not and did not. Joker, seen in this light, is almost a strangely twisted counterpart to Batman, as both figures have dedicated themselves to perseverance within the meaninglessness and the absurd, all the while going about it in nigh opposite directions. In a nutshell, to blink while staring into the abyss is to lose sight of the moment by only looking at eternity, and no human being can survive this too long without falling into some state of nihilistic despair that is unending. However, it's not the case that the opposite end of the spectrum does not exist, and it's arguably more common. and it brings with it problems of its own. In fact, the microscale is a much more common cognitive trap for the human ape. The converse of blinking whilst gazing into the abyss is not blinking, but rather not seeing the abyss at all. This too creates a mental disequilibrium of deluded thoughts of personal grandiosity, grandeur, hyperbolic self-importance, and hubris. Whereas the Owlman archetype can only see beyond his nose, the man trapped within the microscale sees his nose and nothing else. And there are variants of this, of course. You might think that religious individuals are the exceptions here, but they're not. The hyper-religious individual typically only sees his own nose, but everything, by way of analogy, is an extension of the nasal. His metaphysics, his worldview, his self-absorption. In such cases, it's insufficient that personal grandiosity would only extend to the self. Rather, eternity itself is somehow concerned with the lone individual's fumblings in the cosmos, no matter what their actual inconsequentiality. But where does all this leave us in the current crisis of meaning? Well, for one thing, it tells us there is nothing novel about it. In fact, it is inherent to the human condition, and the different forms it takes on are simply concatenations of the specific circumstances that give rise to the distinctions. Clown world, however inventive the term might be, is nothing new. It just happens to be the current incarnation of madcaps on display. In the beginning, I spoke of the automaticity of meaning generation, and this is something that most human beings do rather well. Whether it is cooking a nice meal, playing a video game, or obsessively pursuing some project of personal importance, the meaning in all of these things is encapsulated in the action itself, nothing more, nothing less. And this is something that we can all do, at least to some degree. The abyss is ever present, but you can only be swallowed by it if you lose sight of the balance between the bigger and the smaller picture. Now, part of the issue is the fact that even the localized creation of meaning has become more difficult, which then drives people towards the macroscopic view, which in turn leads them down the Owlman trap. And here is where we come to a rather circular problem. The initial failure to create localized meaning pushes many to the grand-scale thinking after meaning, which routinely fails, and subsequently detracts from the localized effort. It is a vicious circle, but one that, assuming careful attention is paid, is not inevitable. Its frequency is as much a function of human beings and what they are, as it is a function of the new internet and social media-dominated environment and era, which reinforces this vicious cycle. The key to escaping it lies in paying attention to cause and effect and understanding the nature of the cycle. And thus, the secret of Sisyphus is to be found in his unwavering commitment to the proximate, without losing sight of why the proximate matters, which can only be gleaned after becoming aware of a much greater picture than the confines of one's own nose, a task far more difficult than one is wont to imagine. Thank you very much for watching, and please subscribe if you have not yet done so, and please leave a like and share, and hit the bell icon if possible. As this channel operates off of the generosity and contributions of its subscribers, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Any and all support is more than appreciated. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.